1, 2, 3, test, 1, 2, 3, test. This is a test for the English captioning. 1, 2, 3, test, 1, 2, 3, test. This is a test for the English captioning. Test conclusive. Thank you. 1, 2, 3, test, 1, 2, 3, test. Ceci est un test pour le captioning français. 1, 2, 3, test, 1, 2, 3, test. Ceci est un test pour le captioning français. 1, 2, 3, test, 1, 2, 3, test. Ceci est un test pour le captioning français. 1, 2, 3, test, 1, 2, 3, test. Ceci est un test pour le captioning français.
Welcome, distinguished participants. Before we begin, I'd like to call upon the Secretariat for a very quick announcement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A quick reminder that in this room, there's free seating. Make sure that the nameplates you're using correspond to your status, Indigenous peoples, national human rights institutions, member states. We have some few nameplates for national human rights institutions. If you don't find one, please go to the conference officers. We can issue some others, but please make sure that you're using the correct nameplate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bailyn. On behalf of the expert mechanism, I welcome all of you to this important discussion on enhancing the participation of Indigenous peoples in the United Nations. From the earliest days of the League of Nations and the important advocacy efforts of the Maori representative Ratana, also Desgahe, their efforts to pry open the doors of the League of Nations based on, from their estimation, the abrogation of the rights that were affirmed in the earliest treaties. This has been an objective of Indigenous peoples. So we're here today to continue that long-standing discussion of ensuring the proper recognition of Indigenous nations, peoples, and their membership within the hallowed halls of this premier international organization. So this effort to ensure that we're direct and effective participants in the realm of international relations is the subject matter for today's discussion, a continuation of this discussion. Article 41 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples clearly calls for the establishment of ways and means to ensure Indigenous participation on issues affecting them. This is not just a principle. It is a commitment that we collectively, as Indigenous peoples and as UN member states, must actively uphold. In 2022, the expert mechanism contributed to a workshop exploring how to strengthen Indigenous engagement in the Human Rights Council. Since then, the Council, through resolutions 54/12 and 57/15, has taken meaningful steps to continue these discussions. Last year's 2 intersessional meetings brought together member states, Indigenous peoples from all 7 sociocultural regions, UN agencies, as well as civil society and academics. I guess I can include them in civil society. They addressed critical topics, including accreditation mechanisms, participation, modalities, preventing and addressing reprisals, and a host of other issues. The expert mechanism firmly believes that an Indigenous-led accreditation mechanism is essential. While we're open to playing a supportive role, we stress, especially in the face of the liquidity crisis, that adequate resources, both technical and financial, are vital. As we continue today's dialogue, our aim is threefold. 1, to contribute to the ongoing effort to fulfill the 2014 World Conference commitment on Indigenous peoples' participation in the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. 2, to take stock of the valuable recommendations from the 2024 intersessional meetings, and 3, to identify concrete actions to overcome barriers and establish effective participation mechanisms to finalize our mutual objective of the direct participation of Indigenous peoples in the United Nations. This conversation, the one we'll have today, is critical to shaping our final recommendations to the Human Rights Council. We look forward to working together with Indigenous peoples and member states to ensure that Indigenous voices are not only heard, but fully empowered at every level of UN decision-making. Let me now turn to our distinguished panelists. I would like to start by giving the floor to my colleague and fellow expert mechanism member, Mr. Binota Moy Damai. Binota.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the EMRIP, distinguished panelists, excellencies, delegates, Indigenous peoples, representatives, sisters and brothers. Kolomka Frumkaham, I bring greetings in my mother tongue, Kokborok. I am Binota Moy Dhamai, a member of the Tripura Indigenous community from the Chittagong Hill Tracts region of Bangladesh. At the outset, I paid tribute to Indigenous leaders and elders who sacrificed for the cause of Indigenous people's voices to be heard at the national and international forum. My deepest appreciation to the expert mechanism for its facilitation and dedicated leadership for this important dialogue, and to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for its continued support. It's a great honor to speak on this panel today as Indigenous co-facilitator. I'm humbled and honored to have been nominated for this role by Indigenous peoples and subsequently appointed by the President of the Human Rights Council. Let me congratulate every one of us, states and Indigenous peoples representatives, for 2 successful intersessional meetings and for the report which is adopted by the Human Rights Council this last June session. My deepest appreciation to Indigenous peoples and member states for their constructive contributions and unwavering dedication, participated with openness and commitment to this evolving process. These dialogues brought together Indigenous peoples, representatives, states, and experts to examine how we can collectively enhance the meaningful and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of the Council. Our discussions have been enriched by the diversity of perspectives and the shared commitment to justice and equality. Let me start with this. Participation is not just about presence. It is about power, inclusion, and recognition. Participation is not a privilege, it's a right. For Indigenous peoples, the right is not only enshrined in Article 18 of the UN Declaration, but also forms a cornerstone of our collective dignity, identity, and self-determination. These intersessional meetings serve as a vital space to examine how the Council can institutionalize this right in its practice and structures. Madam Chair, please allow me to briefly highlight my observation of the 2 intersessional meetings. One of the central themes emerging from the discussions was the urgent need for the Council to establish a distinct and appropriate status for Indigenous peoples, one that is separate from existing civil society or NGO modalities. The current ECOSOC accreditation framework does not adequately reflect the unique legal, political, and cultural identities of Indigenous peoples as rights holders under international law. A repeated call from Indigenous peoples was that Indigenous peoples must be the ones to identify their own representative, grounded in self-determination, autonomy, customary governance, and cultural practices. Recognition must not be imposed by externally or be subject to state discretion. This requires a sui generis accreditation mechanism tailored to the realities of Indigenous governance systems and guided by the principles of the EMRIP. Furthermore, Indigenous peoples expressed that the participation must be meaningful and effective, It must extend beyond symbolic participation. These include designated seating, co-facilitation of events, and distinct indigenous peoples' bases. Here also a comprehensive list was proposed that includes observer status without voting rights, equal speaking time to observer states, full participation in the UPR sessions, and the ability to engage in informal negotiations. The shared views expressed was that these modalities should reflect the principles of self-determination and self-identification. Esteemed colleagues and delegates, many states participated in good faith in the last two intersessional meetings. Some states raised concerns regarding procedural consistency and coherence within the UN system. However, there was a shared recognition that the current system is not working and that a tailored mechanism is not only desirable but necessary to align with the UN human rights commitment. It was encouraging to witness a growing openness among state representatives to innovative, flexible, and inclusive approaches that respect both the integrity of the UN Charter and the distinct status of indigenous peoples. The discussion showed that this is not a matter of political accommodation, but of rights recognition and institutional reform. Participation is not an end in itself. It is a means to ensure justice, accountability, and equality within global human rights governance. We all know that when indigenous peoples participate meaningfully, the outcomes are stronger, more just, and more sustainable. I must also say that throughout both meetings, a strong emphasis was placed on ensuring regional balance and intersectional inclusivity, giving voice to, particularly from the global south. We must not replicate inequalities within our own mechanisms of inclusion. Our process must reflect the full spectrum of indigenous people's experience and leadership. There are valuable precedents from the UN bodies that can guide our path. The modalities established for the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, expert mechanism itself, and the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples 2014 demonstrate that with political will, structural innovation is possible. These models provide practical insights for designing a robust mechanism for the Council that recognizes indigenous peoples as partners in shaping human rights norms, not just as a subject of concern. The joint report, which includes recommendations for actions and next steps, was submitted to the Council and adopted in the last Council session. It is contained in A/HRC/59/35, drawing from the rich and constructive dialogue at both intersessional meetings in July and October last year. Madam Chair, esteemed colleagues and delegates, the road toward equal participation is part of the broader journey toward decolonization, justice, and reconciliation. Indigenous peoples have waited too long to be fully heard in decisions that affect their lives, lands, and rights. This is not merely a procedural issue, it is a matter of transforming the Council into a truly inclusive and representative institution. My urging to the Council to take bold and principled action, let us not lose the momentum we have built. Let's work together to ensure that indigenous people voices are no longer marginalized but amplified, not as a guest in this space, but as rightful actors in the architecture of human rights. Allow me to conclude with expressing my heartfelt thanks to my co-facilitators, Australia and Canada, the colleagues Matthew Fowler and Amélie Gourdieu, Juan Nunes from the OHCHR for the support, the Human Rights Council Secretariat, EMRIP experts, and the Secretariat UN Voluntary Fund, the Indigenous Coordinating Body, and DOSIP for their support. In closing, Madam Chair, I want to highlight a special individual that I think this is part of the recognition as well. I take this opportunity to pay tribute to my former colleague from the Indigenous Coordinating Body, with whom many of us worked together, not only on this participation process, but who has also contributed to this global indigenous peoples movement, Mr. Estebancio Castro Diaz, a Kuna leader from Panama, who was a member of the first batch of the UN Indigenous Fellowship Program in 1999. He left us for the spiritual world during the COVID pandemic. I miss you, buddy. I'm looking forward to a constructive discussion and hearing to all of you for moving forward with this enhanced participation process. I thank you, Madam Chair. Kulumka Hambai Malaino.
Klianak Benota, for your remarks and your recognition of the role that our brother Estebancio played in this important work. I would now like to give the floor to the two state co-facilitators. Australia co-facilitated the dialogue for the first intersessional meeting, and Canada co-facilitated the second. I call upon His Excellency, Mr. Justin Mohammed, Australian Ambassador for First Nations people, and he'll be followed by Her Excellency, Patricia McCullough, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations Office, as well as other international organizations here in Geneva for their joint remarks. Justin?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to also just acknowledge all Indigenous people here today, and thank you for your ever sacrifice and guidance in these very important conversations and decisions that we're making. Australia reaffirms its long-standing position that meaningful Indigenous participation is fundamental to the fairness and integrity of human rights and the United Nations process. The participation of Indigenous peoples supports the fundamental strength of the United Nations system, upholding the principles of inclusion and diversity. As an international community, we share responsibility to ensure that our dialogues and decisions-making processes are genuinely inclusive and representatives of all voices. Deliberations at the United Nations meetings are richer, more informative, more diverse when Indigenous peoples have been able to participate, and we must not lose sight of this. Australia was proud to co-facilitate, alongside Canada, of the historic intersessional meetings of the Human Rights Council last year. These discussions saw strong leadership from Indigenous peoples and sought to break down the barriers to their full and meaningful participation in the United Nations. As noted by my colleague from Canada, a key focus of these meetings and the successful report was outlining an approach to accreditation for Indigenous peoples' participation in their own right in the work of the Council. Accreditation should be grounded in the principles of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including self-determination and self-identification, as well as equality amongst regions, non-discrimination, transparency, and accountability. Accreditation for Indigenous representatives needs to be Indigenous-led and flexible to account for the diversity of forms of Indigenous peoples, representatives, and institutions internationally. To this end, accreditation should be guided in a flexible manner by elements including reciprocal recognition by other Indigenous peoples, the presence of self-governance, traditional authorities or representative institutions, connection to or relationship with traditional lands, territories, and resources, common ancestry with original occupants of traditional or ancestral lands and territories, shared history and culture, preservation, possession of or use of shared Indigenous languages, including those in the process of being revitalised. Of note, state recognition of Indigenous peoples, while a relevant factor in some contexts, must not be the determinant criteria for accreditation. Moreover, Indigenous peoples, representatives before the Human Rights Council should be legitimately represented of their peoples and chosen by Indigenous peoples in accordance to their own procedures. The intersessional meetings also explain the venues of participation and enhancing participation modalities. Indigenous peoples should be able to participate under the new status in venues of the Human Rights Council that may address issues affecting them, including at a minimum in council venues open to national human rights institutions and NGOs. Moreover, Indigenous peoples should be granted arrangements and modalities that allow for their effective and meaningful participation in the work of the Human Rights Council. Indigenous peoples should be recognised for their distinct status from NGOs. Speaking time and other arrangements and modalities should be at least the equivalent to those granted to national human rights institutions and NGOs. There's also a need to ensure adequate resourcing, especially for the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous peoples, which has been directly supporting Indigenous peoples' participation at the UN for 40 years. The Voluntary Fund helps to overcome one of the key obstacles to Indigenous peoples' attendance at the UN meetings, the financial cost. Australia has made a further contribution to addition to our annual contribution to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to support the extension of the mandate to include World Heritage Committee meetings, another key milestone fought and won by Indigenous peoples at the General Assembly in 2024. As partners of the World Heritage Protection, Indigenous peoples have an important role to play in those discussions. As participation is enhanced, there is also a real risk that exposure to reprisals may increase as well. All forms of reprisals for engagement with the UN must be condemned unequivocally and redressed promptly to ensure Indigenous peoples can freely, safely, and fully participate in discussions on issues that impact them. The annual EMRIP sessions and recent advances in the Human Rights Council should serve as a positive example for the rest of the UN system. We encourage innovative ideas by which Indigenous people's right to participate can further be enhanced. Chair, to conclude, we reaffirm our commitment to meaningful Indigenous participation because fairness, integrity, and lasting progress depend on inclusive participation. This is not just the right thing to do, it leads to better outcomes for all. I would like now to hand back to the Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed. Ms. McCullough, please.
Thank you, Chair, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the expert mechanism for inviting me to participate today in this panel. I extend my respect and appreciation to all the other panelists and to Indigenous participants and all participants in our discussion today. The intersessional meetings on concrete ways to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of the Human Rights Council held in July and October 2024 marked an historic milestone. For the first time, Indigenous peoples were able to participate in the work of the HRC in their own right. Moreover, throughout the intersessional meetings, Indigenous participants demonstrated an unprecedented level of coordination in their positions and recommendations to the HRC. In those meetings, we heard expressions of strong support for the rights of Indigenous peoples and for their enhanced participation in the work of the HRC. We also heard a range of perspectives and questions from states. Discussions were centered around 5 key issues and premised a central conclusion. The Human Rights Council should establish a new separate accreditation status for Indigenous peoples, allowing them to participate in the work of the Council in their own right. The 5 issues discussed were accreditation mechanism, accreditation principles, venues of participation, participation modalities, and preventing and addressing reprisals. Discussions on an accreditation mechanism took place across both intersessional meetings. At the first intersessional, this discussion centered on questions about what form the accreditation mechanism should take. The consensus from the majority of states present and Indigenous participants was that it is necessary for the HRC to establish a new accreditation mechanism, though some states and Indigenous participants recommended that the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples act as the mechanism. Discussions at the second intersessional meeting built upon the outcomes of the first meeting. States and Indigenous participants alike voiced support for the creation of a new, transparent, inclusive, independent, Indigenous-led mechanism with equal representation from the 7 socio-cultural regions. Present fiscal realities notwithstanding, the accreditation mechanism should be supported by a well-resourced and staffed secretariat to function adequately. Most states and Indigenous participants agreed that the expert mechanism could act as an interim mechanism with the provision of the necessary human and financial resources for delivery of that additional mandate. I thank you.
Thank you to both of the co-facilitators from UN member states. I would now like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Jose Francisco Calize, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Guatemala to the UN office and other international organizations in Geneva, and a long-standing ally in the area of Indigenous human rights. Francisco?
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Chair, EMRIP experts, state representatives, Indigenous peoples representatives, distinguished participants. Thank you very much for the floor. It's a great honor for Guatemala to be able to once again participate in this panel, where we will be tackling an issue of extreme priority, the strengthening of the participation of Indigenous people in the work of the Human Rights Council. As co-facilitators and presenters of the resolution entitled Human Rights and Indigenous Peoples as of 2008, Guatemala and Mexico have been working to support Indigenous peoples and have constantly reiterated that nothing should be done about Indigenous peoples without their full and effective participation. We greet the fact that thanks to Resolution 54/12, we have seen a strengthening of the space to inclusively tackle aspects such as participation principles and modalities. I'd like to thank the representatives of Canada and Australia, who as states acted as co-facilitators, and also thank my brother and colleague, Mr. Binuta Moitame, as co-facilitator, Indigenous co-facilitator for the intersessional reunions from last year. These intersessional meetings, on the request of Guatemala and Mexico, allowed the opening up of a space for a transparent, inclusive, and formal discussion under the aegis of the Human Rights Council. We welcome the report that was recently presented, and we're grateful to states and Indigenous peoples for their participation therein. We do recognize that a number of challenges remain around participation, but we would emphasize that in this multilateral space, we do have the possibility of holding discussions and ensuring that all voices are heard. It's important to continue to maintain those spaces in an environment of mutual respect and ensuring always that the human rights of all are upheld. In this vein, we reiterate the importance that Indigenous peoples should be able to enjoy their right to free determination and self-identification, selecting their own representatives in line with their own procedures and in line with Article 18 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We emphasize thereby the importance of ensuring equitable and balanced participation from the 7 socio-cultural regions of Indigenous peoples. And in this context, it's essential to recall that Indigenous peoples should not be considered as or treated as civil society organizations or be confused with the concept of local communities. Rather, they should be considered bearers of collective rights. Chair, we are profoundly concerned by the liquidity crisis currently confronting the United Nations system. It's obvious that a drop in the number of meetings and a rollback in terms of the number of staff is having a direct impact on the work of the Human Rights Council. Indigenous peoples are currently confronting a context of reduced financial resources within the international organizations. This is something which significantly limits their participation within the thematic mechanisms and sessions that are related within the United Nations. This situation is a barrier to the participation of Indigenous peoples' representation. We call on all states to renew their commitment to the strengthening of participation mechanisms and to ensure the effective presence of Indigenous peoples in the Human Rights Council, as well as other relevant fora, to share their voice and their global perspective vis-a-vis the international human rights agenda. Guatemala, alongside Mexico, as presenters of this resolution, human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples, will continue to work to support Indigenous peoples and their rights. We reiterate our commitment to the full implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and our support for the active voice of Indigenous peoples actively contributing to the building of a more equitable and sustainable world. Nothing about Indigenous peoples without Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Priyanakbak Francisco. And last but not least, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Tanya Jakachevich, co-chair of the Indigenous Coordinating Body. Allow me to note that she has been active at the UNFCCC as well on behalf of Indigenous peoples. Please, Tanya, you have the floor.
Tēnā koutou katoa and warm Pacific greetings, everybody. Hiuria hou no Ngāti Kahungunu ki te wairo no te whakatōhia. Thank you, Madam Chair, distinguished members of the expert mechanism, chairperson, members of the permanent forum, special rapporteur, your excellencies, representatives of Indigenous peoples, member states, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tiana Jakisevich. I come from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm honoured to share this panel as co-chair of the Indigenous Coordinating Body to address the 18th session of the expert mechanism under this agenda item. Established in 2022 by Indigenous peoples gathered at the second dialogue meeting held in Quito, Ecuador, the ICB is mandated to facilitate the cooperation and consultation among Indigenous peoples with members from each of the 7 socio-cultural regions, working diligently to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples' representative institutions within the United Nations, particularly the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. Chair, on Monday during our side event, a brother from Burkina Faso rushed into the room from another meeting, breathless but steady. He recalled at the intersessionals he was finally sitting behind a placard that read, Indigenous peoples, and said, "For the first time, I wasn't speaking as one person, but for my whole community. That feeling I want every Indigenous representative to feel. That feeling is what brings us here today, because enhanced participation isn't just about access. It's about recognition, it's about dignity, it's about Indigenous peoples no longer being treated as guests at the UN, but for the self-determining rights holders we are. The Human Rights Council recognized that truth on the 29th of April 2006, when it adopted the resolution on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The General Assembly adopted it on the 13th of September 2007. These milestones are not endpoints. They were the beginning of a promise, and that promise remains unfinished. Our institutions are not NGOs. We are not civil society. We are peoples in our own right, self-determining through our own political institutions that have endured despite centuries of erasure and colonization. Yet today, we still arrive at the UN asking for what should be obvious, the ability to speak for ourselves. From today to the 13th of September 2027, the 20th anniversary on the UN Declaration, states have 790 mornings to get this right. This is not pressure for its own sake. This is history calling. The pathway is already mapped. The Alta Outcome document pointed the way forward in 2013. The UN Declaration affirms our right to maintain and develop our own representative institutions. Monumentum, built from the 2020-22 OHCHR expert workshop up to the 2 intersessional meetings, captured the joint report of the Human Rights Council 5935 and distilled the Geneva Principles. In preparing for these intersessionals, we are grateful for the OHCHR and its stock-taking report, the co-facilitators Dr. Benota Demai and the governments of Canada and Australia as well, as the support from the Voluntary Fund, DOSIP, the Métis National Council for making the preparation and coordination of Indigenous peoples a success. Chair, we should and we need to continue this path. This process represents a ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds for Indigenous peoples worldwide. In the midst of everything happening on the ground, this process offers something precious, hope. Hope that the international community will finally recognize what we have always known. When our brother from Burkina Faso spoke of his pride sitting behind that Indigenous people's placard, he was describing more than procedural change. He was describing dignity restored and identity reaffirmed. For states, this process offers something really valuable, the opportunity to restore public faith in multilateralism itself. In times of the budget liquidity crisis, when institutions face growing skepticism, there's opportunity to actually honor the principle of we the peoples you proclaim. To start this next phase, we request the EMRIP to recommend to the Human Rights Council, or that the Human Rights Council takes a decision on enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples in the Council's work, using the joint report of the Human Rights Council 5935 as its substantive basis and ensuring the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples from all 7 sociocultural regions in all stages and at all levels. In conclusion, Chair, this process is not the property of any experts or any one region. It belongs to all Indigenous peoples, from the Arctic to the Amazon, from the forest guardians to nomadic nations, from all of those with established structures to those rebuilding what was taken. This belongs to us all. And the ICB, with its regional representatives hailing from Indigenous peoples, organizations, collectives, and representative institutions, is committed to facilitate and balance the view of all Indigenous peoples on this path. The Geneva Principles emerged from this collective wisdom. Therefore, I look forward to hearing your interventions, because 20 years after the Declaration, Indigenous peoples should not still be asking to enter the room. We should already be seated. The question is not whether enhanced participation will happen. The question is whether you will be a part of making it real. States have the tools, the joint report and the mandate. You have our words and our clarity. The path is mapped. The time is now. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Qianakak Tanya, I'm grateful for your youthfulness and your service as the co-chair of the Indigenous Coordinating Body. Thank you for that service. I would now like to invite other members of the expert mechanism to contribute their reflections, thoughts, comments, if any of the members would like to take the floor at this time. Not presently. Thank you. We do have our counterpart mandates present in the room as well. So I'd like to give, well, let's see, no, the special rapporteur doesn't appear to be present, but Aluki Koteak, chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Daly. Good morning, everyone, and I really appreciated the panelists and the information about the updates of what's happening here. I thought I would take a moment to provide an update on the developments regarding the process to enhance participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The president of the 78th session of the General Assembly appointed the permanent representative of Canada and Peru as co-facilitators to lead consultations on enhancing the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in relevant UN meetings during 2023. To support this process, Dr. Claire Charters and Mr. Belkacem Lunis, both Indigenous experts, were appointed as advisors. Throughout 2024, A series of informal consultations were convened to gather views and inputs from both member states and Indigenous peoples in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 78/189, adopted on 19 December 2023. Based on these inputs, a zero draft resolution on enhancing the participation of Indigenous peoples at the United Nations was adopted on 17 July 2024. This zero draft resolution was more ambitious than the final text ultimately adopted by General Assembly. It proposed that the Secretary General convene a 2-day expert workshop on enhanced participation in January 2025. It also invited ECOSOC to consider implementing provisional measures during its 2025 session to facilitate the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in meetings of subsidiary bodies beyond the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. However, the language of the zero draft resolution was subsequently weakened. The resolution adopted by the General Assembly did not include either the proposal for the expert workshop or the invitation to ECOSOC to consider provisional measures for broader participation. The General Assembly ultimately adopted Resolution A/RES/78/328 on the matter. The resolution merely decided to continue consideration of possible further measures to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in relevant UN meetings during its 80th session beginning in September 2025. The resolution also requested the President of the General Assembly to appoint at the beginning of the 80th session 2 co-facilitators from member states and 2 advisors from Indigenous peoples to support this process, which will include consultations with Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions from all regions of the world as input to the ongoing intergovernmental discussion. Unfortunately, despite the commitments made in the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, there has been limited concrete progress in enhancing the participation of Indigenous peoples in the General Assembly's processes. Nonetheless, I acknowledge that significant progress has been achieved within the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Kayanakbakaluki. I would now like to turn to the speakers list on this particular item. And a request maybe not made previously is it possible for everyone in the room to withhold their applause after each speaker in order to save time and move on to the next speaker? I know that it's the norm to congratulate someone on an intervention well done and the messaging hopefully landing on the right ears, but if we can withhold that, it would be greatly appreciated. I think we can then move more swiftly to the lengthy list of speakers. So thank you in advance for that. I know we'll still hear a few because it's difficult to withhold, but let's see what we can manage. The first speaker on the list is Mr. Jason Taylor Paul, Organización de Nación Autochtone de Guyana. Are you in the room? Please, you have the floor.
La présidente, merci de...
Thank you very much, President. Thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Jason Paul, and I'm speaking here as a member and representative of the Indigenous Persons Organization of Guyana. I belong to the Carina Talawayo of French Guiana, a territory situated between Suriname and Brazil. I'd like to start by thanking the High Commissioner for the Human Rights and the Voluntary Contribution Fund of the United Nations, which have allowed me to be present here as an Indigenous scholar for this year, 2025. During the demonstrations of March to April 2017, the French state signed an agreement protocol with the representatives of Indigenous people relating to 20 commitments. And yet, 8 years later, the French state has not respected this agreement. It still has not restored the 400,000 hectares of land promised to the Indigenous peoples. The Grand Custom Council set up by the French state to represent Indigenous people is failing. It imposes shared governance between Indigenous people and Black people who are resident in the territory, which is incompatible with our customary, with both people's customary practices. This relates also to the exploitation of resources, where the Russian company Norgold has basically taken France to a tribunal for 4 billion euros for having abandoned the mining project in Gold Mountain. France should respect its commitment to abandon this mining project. At the end of the day, we have to note that nothing has changed and everything is decided in Paris, 7,000 kilometers from our country. The French government is taking decisions and the parliament is voting through laws imposed on French Guiana in complete ignorance of the specific characteristics of our territory. This situation cannot last. Those elected and the Guianan population have perfectly understood, and the Indigenous people in Guyana have as well. This is why we are informing the members of MEDPA, as well as the representative states that are present here, that the Indigenous people in Guyana reserve themselves the right to call for the enlistment of French Guiana on the list of countries to be decolonized by the Decolonization Committee in line with Chapter 11 of the UN Charter. Furthermore, we call on the French state to respect its commitments under the 2017 agreements and to respect the Congress decision taken to adopt a new sui generis status for the territory, as done for New Caledonia. Indeed, we would like this process of decolonization to be provided a framework with provided UN observers, and we call for this the Special Rapporteur to visit the country as well as Special Rapporteur on Indigenous rights to determine our self-determination. Thank you.
Aha! You are not good pupils. Allow me to call upon the next speaker. We'll see if the friendly rules can be followed. Actually, it's more of a suggestion rather than a rule. So allow me to give the floor to Chief Willie Littlechild, Grand Council, on behalf of, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but on behalf of Grand Council of the Crees. Willie, you have.
Thank you. In this joint statement, the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples welcomes and supports the process of enhancing the participation of Indigenous peoples in the Human Rights Council. We'd like to thank the co-facilitators for their report on the outcomes of the 2 intersessional meetings. Further, we'd like to highlight and underscore 2 of the recommendations to the expert mechanism. First, paragraph 76 states that the establishment of a new accreditation status must be granted to Indigenous peoples as collectives, not as individuals. The collective right to self-determination is a right enjoyed only by peoples and not organizations or other groups. The enhanced participation process must continue to reaffirm this. Secondly, paragraph 72 of the intersessional meetings report underscores this recognition and emphasizes the distinction of Indigenous peoples from NGOs. As collectives who hold the right to self-determination, Indigenous peoples must have a status that recognizes they are peoples. Since time immemorial, Indigenous peoples have exercised their own governance, created their own laws, and stewarded their own territory. To be clear, Indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations around the world have robust civil societies that play an important role. However, it is important to recognize that NGOs and civil society groups already have the ability to participate in their own right. Indigenous peoples who hold the right to self-determination through their representative institutions do not. Paragraph 81 recommends the creation of a new independent accreditation mechanism to determine the eligibility of Indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations for the new separate accreditation status. This new mechanism, as we heard already this morning, must be led by Indigenous peoples from each of the 7 geopolitical, socio-cultural regions. It must also be adequately funded and include a well-staffed secretariat. This funding is crucial to effectively enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the Human Rights Council. Enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples in the Human Rights Council stems directly from Article 3 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that affirms Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. Self-determination is a right guaranteed to all peoples. And if I may digress for a second, Madam Chair, thanks to you who ensured that Article 3 was included in the UN Declaration. Thank you for that. Article 3 follows Article 1 and 2, which articulates that Indigenous peoples are free and equal to all other peoples and are subject of international law. While this has always been true, historically, it has not always been recognized in the United Nations nor in UN member states. Enhanced participation is a part of correcting the historic lack of recognition. Enhanced participation through the creation of a new accreditation status for representative institutions of Indigenous peoples would be a significant achievement. A commitment to self-determination must include centering it as a principle in accreditation and the provision of sufficient funding to make accreditation possible. To follow through on an accreditation process without sufficient commitment of funds and human rights would be unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Willie Littlechild. I'd now like to call upon Grizel Rodriguez from Panama.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Agradecemos a los panelistas.
Thank you, Chair. We thank the panelists for the valuable contributions, and we congratulate the facilitators and also the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights for all of the work carried out during this process. As in other occasions, my delegation supports the strengthened participation of Indigenous peoples in the United Nations, including in the Human Rights Council, through the establishment of a new category for accreditation that will make it possible for them to participate in these fora. Their specialized knowledge and cosmovision are crucial to face the most important challenges facing humanity. For example, the triple planetary crisis related to climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and pollution, and for the study of emerging issues, for example, the impact on human rights of new technologies, especially artificial intelligence, and the world problem of drugs. In the Council, Indigenous peoples should be able to participate in the discussions that deal with issues that are of great concern to them, and as a minimum during the periods of regular and special sessions and the subsidiary bodies, including negotiations on resolutions and legally binding instruments in the UPR and intersessional activities. The aspects relative to the general principles and the mechanism for accreditations, the institutions, and the modalities for participation that have been examined in a broad, transparent, inclusive manner, taking into account the best practices that may happen in these fora in order to ensure that future discussions should focus on how to operationalize the recommendations contained in the reports of the co-facilitators and the Office of the High Commissioner, while ensuring that the liquidity crisis doesn't create any additional obstacles. It's of crucial importance to work together on the fundamental principles contained in the Declaration of the United Nations of the Rights of Persons, Indigenous peoples, highlighting free determination, self-identification, flexibility, equality between different social cultural regions, non-discrimination, transparency, and accountability, and the decisions of the mechanism of accreditation that should not be subject to any form of a veto. Would like to find out, asking the panelists, and EMRIP, what guidance can you provide us in terms of a roadmap to follow during the upcoming session of the Council in September? Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I'm sure that the panelists took note of the question, and when they come back to give some closing remarks, hopefully they can be responsive to it. The next speaker is Sierra William, Chilcotin National Government. Sierra.
Distinguished members of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, excellencies, and respected Indigenous leaders and elders. I am Sierra William from the Thaitkotin Nation. The Thaitkotin Nation wishes to thank the expert mechanism for conveying this important panel discussion and for providing an opportunity to share additional reflections and follow up on the most recent intersessional meetings of the Human Rights Council held in July and October 2024 on concrete ways to enhance the participation on Indigenous peoples in the work of the Council. We wish to thank Australia and Canada, who served as the state co-facilitators of the first and second intersessional meetings, and Bino Moy Dea. As Indigenous co-facilitator for both meetings, we thank them for the joint report that was prepared with Office of High Commissioner. Of course, we also like to thank them for their presentations today, along with other panel participants. We think that the report has done a very good job of capturing the outcomes from the intersessional meetings, and would like to underscore some critical issues. As we stated at the intersessional in October 2024, as an Indigenous nation, the Thaitkotin have the right to self-determination and self-governance. We are not NGOs. As a nation with our own distinct laws, customs, and governance systems, we respect the diversity in the governance structures amongst Indigenous peoples globally. Therefore, an inclusive and flexible consideration and process, and the mechanism is needed that honors the diversity in governance structures without imposing uniform or prescriptive criteria or a definition. As such, we believe it is important to use consideration principles, or so-called Geneva principles, that are jointly developed during the intersessional meetings as starting place, and fixed criteria should be avoided. It is our hope that these principles can be adopted as practical measures and advance this important work. The nation strongly believes that Indigenous peoples should lead the development of separate and independent consideration mechanisms without a state veto or interference. Therefore, we agree with the recommendation to create a new transparent, inclusive, independent, Indigenous-led mechanisms with equal representation from 7 socioeconomic regions. Finally, we fully agree that the states should ensure that significant resources are available to implement all measures necessary for enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of Human Rights Council. Our enhanced participation is important work and is long overdue. Sichanalya, thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is an online speaker, Ms. Maria Essen from Finland.
Thank you. I'm actually here in the room.
Grateful for that.
Can you? Chair, members of representatives, dear participants, Finland is pleased to continue this important discussion on enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples in the UN. Over the past year, we have together taken historical steps in the right direction. In the HRC session last autumn, Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions duly established by themselves participated at the interactive dialogues with EMRIP and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. While we can and should celebrate positive developments, there is still plenty to be done to secure meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in all issues concerning their rights, lands, and territories. The expertise, perspectives, and contributions of Indigenous peoples are indispensable to support the work of the Human Rights Council. Finland remains strongly committed to finding sustainable solutions to all remaining questions. We, therefore, welcome the 2 intersessional meetings on concrete ways to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of the Human Rights Council and the report published of the outcomes of these meetings. We continue to emphasize that Indigenous peoples themselves should be in the lead. We must find ways to support active engagement from all 7 sociocultural regions. It goes without saying that Indigenous women, as well as youth, must have a seat at the table. In no circumstance can we tolerate reprisals against anyone speaking in these halls. We must jointly do our utmost and more that no one will be targeted for defending human rights of their own or of their respective people. Chair, on a different note, if you allow me, I would like to comment on a topic raised earlier this week, the reform of the Act on the Sami Parliament. We are happy and relieved that we finally have succeeded in reaching our goal to renew the Act in accordance with our Constitution and human rights obligations. We are grateful that EMRIP was involved in the process through a country engagement mission already in 2018, focusing on the 2 most challenging sections of the Act, the definition of the Sami and the obligation to negotiate. The bill was submitted to Parliament in 2023. We were happy that the Constitutional Law Committee decided to hear EMRIP, and we wish to thank EMRIP and especially Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot for a most useful statement. We are happy that EMRIP's expertise was recognized in this way also by a national parliament. In June, the Parliament approved the bill in accordance with the report of the Constitutional Law Committee that suggested only 2 minor changes. In the end, the Act was approved by a large majority of votes, even if the process has been exceptionally challenging, also politically. 1 week later, the President approved the amendments to the Act and decided that it will enter into force on August 1st. I wish to thank the Sami Parliament for patience and excellent cooperation over the years, as well as EMRIP for its support and flexible cooperation in this important matter. EMRIP has revised its experts' notes along the process when changes have been made to the draft bill. Also, EMRIP has participated in an international seminar on the topic and offered support in many ways. We can warmly recommend other states to make use of EMRIP's mandate to engage in country engagement missions and its support in difficult matters. I'm happy to note that we have finally managed to fulfill our obligations related to the self-determination and human rights of Indigenous peoples, the Sami. This is a historic moment for Finland. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement, and in particular, the intersection of this recent legislation and enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples. The next speaker is Jimena Contle from Conadepoa. You have the floor.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Chair, representatives, members of EMRIP, brothers and sisters. I welcome you. To love, to learn, to respect. These are the seeds that guide our words, and from that spot we come to share. From the millenary tradition of the Anáhuac, we extend a greeting to the International Assembly on behalf of the Grandfathers Major Council of Wisdom from the Conadepoa, and we share his voice. The inclusion and strengthening of the participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of the United Nations returned us to the origins. And it's not a step back, but it reminds us that all seeds know how to grow. We have participated here, taking care of our land, respecting our words, living in harmony with cycles of life, and we are using this space that is opening, because when people speak with fire, when they are in harmony with water and use winds, they follow the ancient paths of harmony and balance. We're here to share, not to impose, but also to offer, and we offer our languages that are the languages of land, and they are deeply seated in the past, and we have to listen to the justice that stems from the heart. We offer our ceremonies, that they're the force of the present. With gratitude, we recognize that this international space has been open to those hearts that are open, and we understand that we're one single human tribe, and this is a deep sense of humanity that overcomes separation. We're just one heart, and this message, as original people, we send a message of unity, a link with the sacred, with all forms of life, our forms of moving forward in respect and relation to everything that might be the guiding light in such difficult times for humanity. We have to recall that we should be here present on this planet and honor life, and we should take care. This form of living, of singing and breathing throughout our people, and we thank you for this meeting, and the sounds of earth should be heard in this room, and that spirit of love and respect should fill these shared spaces. Thank you.
Gracias, con todo el corazón.
Thank you.
Thank you from the depth of my heart.
Thank you for your presentation. The next speaker is Mr. Rodrigo Pintado, Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Chair. At the outset, I'd like to thank the distinguished representatives of EMRIP and also the representatives on behalf of Mexico and Guatemala. Mexico is one of the countries that has shown leadership in the strengthened participation that is effective and full, as well as the recognition of indigenous peoples in different multilateral forums. Our last 3 decades, we have supported the processes related to the establishment of the permanent forum on indigenous questions, the creation of EMRIP, and creation of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. In this respect, in line with the significant transformations that we see happening in Mexico, for example, the constitutional reform related to the rights of indigenous peoples adopted on 30 September 2024, Mexico supports the establishment of a category for full and effective participation of indigenous peoples with a nature that is distinct from that of organizations of civil society recognized as a legal person and collective subjects of rights with their own forms of organization, land, and heritage, respecting their right to self-determination. And also, as was highlighted by the distinguished representative of Guatemala, we support the report submitted by the co-facilitators of OHCHR on the participation of indigenous peoples and the work of the Human Rights Council. Following those principles, in February 2024 in Mexico, we established a National Council for Indigenous Peoples that is a consultative mechanism for the government of Mexico to work together with these peoples and communities in the area of public policies. The council includes 181 members representing 70 indigenous peoples and Afro-Mexican peoples that are elected through assemblies organized by indigenous communities themselves. One of the councilors, Ms. Catalina Ramirez Hernandez, is here in the room and is part of the delegation of Mexico participating in the session of EMRIP. We will continue to be promoting in the United Nations and especially in the Human Rights Council a strengthened participation of indigenous peoples, always taking into account their voice and the aspirations of these peoples. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. The next speaker is Lydia Margosian, Assemblée des Arméniens. It's a joint statement.
Non. Il s'agit, oui, et c'est ici. Bonjour.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. I'd like to welcome participants to this assembly and praise the efforts of all Indigenous people in their efforts in the implementation and defense of their rights. Starting in 2005, after decades of submission and silence, the Armenians of Western Armenia, saved from genocide and exiled from their ancestral homeland, have moved forward step by step towards a social accession to bring them to the foot of the edifice named the United Nations organizations. They, after different forms of analysis and different experiences, have found them within an indigenous family, a family that recognized them as orphans and a family that accepted them to strengthen a struggle to live and exist as a primary nation of our planet. These Armenian orphans that we are, orphans stripped of their ancestral home, are here together with you, and they represent just a small portion of this light that is shared by everyone, but also some of those present here in these sacred chambers show the state of their existence and fight those who want to destroy them and go back to their ancestral lands, a source of life and energy. Indeed, in the face of all of these crimes, it is high time to start to repair, and I repeat, repair this existing situation and to begin the step towards the justices. It's crucial for peoples and nations to organize and realize their right to self-determination by setting up representative institutional structures in line with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so they could continue their participation in the work of the United Nations and including in the Human Rights Council. Armenians of Western Armenia, their parliamentary assembly, their government, and their national council fully support the strengthening of their participation in the United Nations. And this statement is made by Armenians of South Africa and in line with Article 18. And I'd like to really thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now invite Ms. Nyungok Higland on behalf of Government of Greenland and Kingdom of Denmark.
Thank you.
You have the floor.
Oyanok. Thank you, Chair. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Denmark together with Greenland. Enhanced participation of Indigenous people at the United Nations remain an important priority for the Danish government and for my government in Greenland. We commend the expert mechanisms of the rights of Indigenous people for placing this important topic on the agenda again. We would also like to thank Australia and Canada, who took on the role as state co-facilitators, as well as the Indigenous co-facilitator, Binota Moi Tamai, for their excellent work in regards to the intersessional meetings held last year here in Geneva on concrete ways to enhance the participation of Indigenous people in the works of the Human Rights Council. In our view, enhanced participation consists of two fundamental pillars. One is recognition of the legitimate representatives and institutions of Indigenous peoples, and the other is having access to and participation in all bodies at the UN affecting those rights of Indigenous peoples. In regard to the second pillar, Indigenous peoples' participation has proven good results. For us, the practical working modalities applied in the open-ended working group on the draft of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People served as a good example of full, effective, and meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples can lead to a successful outcome. Likewise, preparation for the World Conference on Indigenous People in 2014, including the recognition of the ADLA outcome document of the Global Indigenous Preparatory Conference, is something that we hold high in regard. We are confident that Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions will bring knowledge, expertise, and worldviews that will add legitimacy and sustainability to the decisions adopted by the United Nations, we must remember that it's not an option, but an obligation under the EMRIP. Let me conclude by expressing our full support for the mandate of the expert mechanism of the rights of Indigenous people. Esteemed experts, what do you see as possible next steps to further enhance Indigenous people's participation in the work of the Human Rights Council? Koyanak.
Thank you for your statement. The next speaker is Kenneth Deere, Indigenous World Association.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Kenneth Deere, a Mohawk, one of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, which most people know as the Six Nations Confederacy or the Iroquois Confederacy, which includes the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations. I'm here to speak on behalf of Chief Diskahe, who sits here with me. Diskahe is a chieftainship title handed down from generation to generation from before European contact. One of his processors with the same title came to Geneva in 1923 and 24 to address the League of Nations. He was denied speaking because the Haudenosaunee were not members of the League. So the Haudenosaunee applied for membership to the League, but their application was never brought to the floor for a vote in violation of the rules of the League. Such is the opposition of Indigenous peoples at the international level. The Haudenosaunee are a government, one that is centuries old, older than probably most, if not all, of the states in this room. We have our own constitution called the Great Law of Peace, which binds our Six Nations together. We have our own traditional territory, ability to make laws, our own culture and languages. We make agreements with other governments. We have treaties with the Netherlands, France, Great Britain, and the United States of America. NGOs do not sign treaties. We are not ethnic minorities. We are not a local community. Therefore, it stands to reason that Indigenous peoples like the Haudenosaunee should be able to address the League as their own representative institution. It is now 102 years since the denial of Diskahe to address the League of Nations, and now he is still denied to speak as a government in the United Nations. Diskahe sits here and will not speak until he is able to address the UN at a level appropriate to the stature as a representative of his people. The symbolism of his silence is a reflection of the Indigenous struggle for proper recognition in the United Nations. Do we have to wait another 100 years for him to speak? The recommendations at international meetings offer a possible remedy for this problem. It can create a system where our representatives can speak without the indignity of declaring themselves a non-government. As a constructive way forward, we request that the expert mechanism recommend to the Human Rights Council to decide on the enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of the Human Rights Council based on the International Joint Report, with the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples from the 7 Indigenous social-cultural regions. We propose to the Human Rights Council that the institution demonstrate to the rest of the United Nations that the rights of Indigenous peoples can be respected and exercised in a manner appropriate to the dignity and equality of Indigenous peoples as all other peoples. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Kenneth, for that statement. The next speaker is Ms. Iva Gavrilova from the European Union, followed by Thomas Aslakyuso. So European Union representative, you have the floor.
Members of the expert mechanism, distinguished Indigenous representatives, the EU remains strongly committed to continuing its active engagement in all efforts to enhance the full, effective, and meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples, representatives, and institutions in relevant United Nations bodies, including meetings of the Human Rights Council on issues affecting them. We have supported the recent measures taken by this Council to enhance the participation of Indigenous people in its plenary debates. Indigenous peoples' insights and expertise are critical in addressing global challenges such as conflicts, climate change, biodiversity loss, and social inequalities. Let's ensure that the voices of Indigenous peoples can resound strong and free and contribute to international discussions on issues affecting them, including UN conferences. Indigenous peoples must be involved not only during the actual negotiations, but also in the preparatory phases and in monitoring the implementation of the policies in question. Recently, the EU and its member states demonstrated their commitment to advance the rights of indigenous peoples, for instance, at the 16th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention of Biological Diversity. The EU strongly supported the creation of a permanent body to implement provisions related to indigenous peoples, which will step up their engagement with and participation in all processes of the convention. Moreover, indigenous peoples should be able to promote human rights, including in the UN meetings, without fear of reprisals, intimidation, or threats of any kind. We stress the importance of the protection of indigenous human rights defenders, including in the context of land and natural resources, and the protection of the environment, biodiversity, and the climate. We also continue to stand for full, effective, and meaningful participation and leadership of indigenous women and youth. Could the expert mechanism share remaining challenges as well as good practices in ensuring the safe participation of indigenous peoples, including indigenous women in UN meetings? Thank you.
Thomas Aslacuso, you have the floor now.
Madam Chair, I deliver this intervention on behalf of the Arctic Sociocultural Region. To meaningfully enhance the participation of indigenous peoples at the United Nations, particularly in the Human Rights Council, it is essential that the process be firmly grounded in indigenous peoples' right to self-determination and self-identification as guaranteed under the Articles 3 and 33 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. This means that indigenous representative institutions, be they elected parliaments, traditional councils, or other authorities, as specified in the ALTA outcome document, must be recognized without imposing externally defined models. Collective representation must be a guiding principle in any future accreditation framework. The Arctic region has identified several gaps in the recent intersessional report, particularly the lack of emphasizing on accountability and respect for existing regional accreditation processes. Despite these concerns, we believe that the report can still serve as a useful foundation for advancing the enhanced participation process and the development of the relevant resolution. It is essential that the report includes meaningful reference to indigenous representative institutions and their key role in ensuring accountability. Accredited entities must uphold transparency and remain accountable to the indigenous peoples they represent. We recommend the following key actions. Number one, request the expert mechanism to recommend to the Human Rights Council to decide on the enhanced participation of indigenous peoples in the work of the Human Rights Council, based on the joint report reflected in Human Rights Council /59/35, with the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples from the 7 indigenous sociocultural regions. 2, from the Arctic perspective, we support advancing a resolution in September session of the Council or alternatively initiating an intergovernmental negotiation process. This should include a clear roadmap with timelines, designated facilitators, and reference to models such as EMRIP mandate review, A/HRC/RES/30/11. 3. Indigenous peoples must have the right to select their own representatives and to be recognized through a new permanent observer status at the Human Rights Council. The accreditation process must reflect diverse governance systems with fair, inclusive, and transparent criteria overseen by indigenous-led body that respects regional and cultural diversity. We remain committed to work collaboratively with all indigenous peoples and states to advance the principles, inclusive and lasting solutions. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for the joint statement. The next speaker is Takahiro Shiota of Japan.
I would like to thank EMRIP and all the esteemed speakers at this session for the insightful discussion held in this specialized forum on the right of indigenous peoples. Allow me to share the position of the government of Japan on several points raised. Japan recognizes the Ainu as an indigenous people primarily residing in and around northern Japan, especially Hokkaido. The government promotes comprehensive and effective policies to ensure that the Ainu people can live with pride and dignity and to build a society in which all citizens respect each other's individuality. Japan affirms that all people, including indigenous peoples, have human rights under international law. Rights to land and resources, as outlined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, are subject to reasonable limitations under domestic law to protect third-party rights and public interests. I would now like to address the situation in Okinawa. The Japan-US alliance and the presence of US forces are essential for Japan's defense and regional peace and stability. The government recognizes the importance of gaining the understanding of local communities, especially in Okinawa, which hosts approximately 70% of US facilities in Japan. Reducing the burden on Okinawa has been a consistent priority for the government. Japan continues to make efforts in cooperation with the US to realign forces and mitigate local impacts. Incidents involving US personnel cause deep concern and must be prevented. Japan urges the US to strictly enforce discipline and implement effective preventive measures. Madam Chair, we understand that PFAS have historically been used in a variety of applications. At present, however, a clear causal relationship between the detection of PFAS in areas surrounding US facilities and the activities of the US forces has not necessarily been established. That said, we recognize that local residents have expressed significant concern regarding PFAS. The government is also addressing concerns regarding PFAS. We are working closely with local authorities and engaging with the US, including the EPA and the Department of Defense. At the 2+2 meeting last year, Japan and the US discussed the strengthening of bilateral environmental cooperation, including on PFAS. The government of Japan has conducted site inspections of US facilities in accordance with the Supplemental Environmental Agreement. Going forward, we will continue working with relevant ministries and the US to ensure effective environmental measures are implemented under the applicable agreements. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Shinako Oyakawa, who will then be followed by the representative from Brazil, and then we'll turn to our panelists for some quick closing remarks. So the joint statement from the Asia Caucus, please.
Thank you, Chair. I lead this statement on behalf of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus. We appreciate EMRIP for including this agenda, and we acknowledge the progress made on this process. We also acknowledge the committed work of the Indigenous Coordinating Body for steering the dialogue on behalf of the Indigenous peoples of the 7 social cultural regions. We thank the co-facilitator who represent us in the 2 intersessional meetings in 2024, Binota Damai, and then also for briefing us on the outcome report during the Global Indigenous Caucus. We welcome the joint reports of the states and indigenous co-facilitators and then OHCHR, which outline the discussions, outcomes, lesson learned, and the next steps of the meetings, including with specific recommendations. Indigenous representatives from Asia actively participated in the 2 intersessionals and then contributed the discussion and provide concrete recommendations that address this issue of venue of participation. Participation moderation, selection criteria, selection modalities, and the next step. We would like to praise the following recommendation to address barriers to participation and propose effective mechanisms for the meaningful participation of indigenous peoples and institutions in meeting and process the United Nations bodies. 1. Asia Caucus urged the Human Rights Council to adopt the resolution of the Council's 16 sessions and adding the outcome of the intersessional meetings as the next document for further discussion. The launch of the intergovernmental process with full indigenous participation. 2, we request the expert mechanism to recommend to the Human Rights Council to decide on the enhanced participation on indigenous peoples in work of the Human Rights Council based on the joint report as reflected in HRC/59/35 with the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples from the 7 indigenous socio-cultural regions.
Okay, the next speaker is Tiago Menez, Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Brazil strongly supports the ongoing discussions to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples in the Human Rights Council and the broader UN system. Brazil supports an inclusive and pragmatic approach aimed at creating lasting modalities that enhance such participation in light with the principles of equality, self-determination, and cultural diversity. Brazil's position in this discussion is guided by 2 key elements. First, we strongly advocate for the equitable representation of indigenous peoples from the 7 social cultural regions, including consideration for the diversity of sub-regions. Second, we emphasize the importance of ensuring linguistic accessibility through interpretation services for indigenous representatives who do not speak any of the UN's 6 official languages. These are essential preconditions for a participatory process that is genuinely inclusive and reflective of the plurality of indigenous voices worldwide. Broader actions taken by the Brazilian government, both domestically and regionally. At the national level, the Brazilian government has resumed and strengthened the National Council for Indigenous Policy, a platform for dialogue and consultation with indigenous organizations and representatives. Regionally, we highlight the creation of the Amazonian Mechanism for Indigenous Peoples, an initiative endorsed by the presidents of the Amazonian countries in 2023. This mechanism aims to foster indigenous leadership in environmental government and regional cooperation, particularly in connection with the protection of the Amazon and the promotion of borders. Brazil also underscores the importance of capacity building for indigenous leadership. The Kuntai Karu Course, a joint initiative of the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, seeks to train young indigenous leaders in diplomacy, climate policy, and international human rights. As we prepare to host the 30th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP30, in Belém do Pará, Brazil is committed to ensuring the most significant indigenous participation in the history of climate negotiations. To this end, the Brazilian COP30 presidency has established the International Indigenous Commissions, which will serve as a primary channel for dialogue between indigenous peoples and the presidency. We are also planning 2 indigenous pavilions, one in the blue zone and another in the gray zone, expected to receive thousands of indigenous representatives. Brazil reaffirms its support for the mechanism and its readiness to contribute to inclusive and effective modalities and reflect the plurality of indigenous peoples worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the panelists, I would like to invite the representative of Norway for a hasty intervention, and then we'll move on to the closing remarks of the panelists. You have the floor.
Chair, I'll try to be hasty. Norway is committed to protecting and promoting the rights of Indigenous peoples, including their right to participate in all decision-making concerning themselves. We are proud to have consistently and proactively supported the processes of enhancing Indigenous peoples' participation in relevant UN meetings, including in the Human Rights Council. Significant progress was made when Indigenous peoples' representatives from the 7 socio-cultural regions participated in the interactive dialogues with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the EMRIP in the Council's 57th session in 2024. This included the Sami Parliament of Norway, which for the first time participated in the Council in its own capacity as the elected representative institution of the Sami people in my country. We commend the core group of the Resolution on Human Rights and Indigenous Peoples, Mexico and Guatemala, for their leadership and encourage further steps to enhance participation. Norway was pleased to participate actively in the Council's intersessional meetings on concrete ways to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of the Council in July and October of 2024. We thank the state co-facilitators Canada and Australia and Indigenous co-facilitator Benota Moidamai for these constructive meetings with broad participation from many states. Having endorsed the report from these meetings, we agree that the Council should use its conclusions and recommendations to take further actions at the Council's next session. Indigenous peoples have a long history of contributing to and enhancing the work of the UN in tackling global and national challenges. The expertise, perspectives, and contributions of Indigenous peoples are essential to the Human Rights Council's work. Norway will continue to support establishing a new separate accreditation status for Indigenous peoples. We support an accreditation process rooted in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and accreditation principles as outlined in the report. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Allow me to begin with Tanya at the far end of the podium here for some profound closing statements in 2 minutes or less.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all for your contributions to this vital discussion on enhanced participation. The voices we heard today on the topic from Indigenous peoples and states confirm what our brother from the Burka Faso knew when he sat behind the Indigenous peoples placard. Change is not only necessary, it's inevitable. In appreciation of Panama's question, we look forward to the inclusion of the joint report in the annual Indigenous Peoples Resolution, capturing the momentum into concrete action. We are counting on the support and flexibility of all states to include the necessary next steps in September, like the delegation of Denmark highlighted examples from the Declaration to the World Conference. Partnership is how we move from rhetoric to architecture, from promises to practices, and the ICB remains available for states and Indigenous peoples for further dialogue. I call on the member states to embrace this opportunity. Starting from today, there are 346 mornings until the Council's 10th anniversary of adopting the declaration text, 790 mornings until the 20th anniversary of the declaration itself. These are not just calendar dates, they are moments of accountability. Let us recall that feeling of dignity should belong for every Indigenous representative who walks through these halls. Representatives like the Haudenosaunee, Daskahe, and Tahu Pōtiki Widumuratama. That feeling should be ordinary, not exceptional, for Indigenous peoples, representatives, institutions. The path is mapped. The time is now. Let us ensure that ray of sunshine breaks through for all Indigenous peoples. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you very much. Francisco?
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I'm very grateful to you for the opportunity of participating in such an important space here at EMRIP. I'm also grateful to those who made statements on the panel up here with me, and also to representatives from Indigenous peoples and states. On behalf of the group of facilitators of the Human Rights and Indigenous Rights Resolution, Guatemala and Mexico have taken note of the statements made in this space. and we're very grateful for your participation. It's essential to retain these spaces for discussion and ensure that all voices are heard, and that this is done in an environment of mutual respect, always ensuring the upholding of the human rights of all. I want to emphasize that the human rights of Indigenous peoples is right in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also with the final outcome document of the high-level meeting of the General Assembly, known as the Global Conference on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Chairperson, Guatemala will continue to foster initiatives that will strengthen the participation of Indigenous peoples in all affairs concerning them, and discussed in the various fora at the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Ambassador Mohammed.
Like the other speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the significant support expressed in the room today from both Indigenous peoples and also states. I'd also like to acknowledge the wise counsel and advice and reminder of how important period we are in at this moment from our esteemed elders and chiefs in the room. I would see the joint report as something that can provide the important guidance for the next steps. And again, want to reiterate Australia's support and enhanced participation and for the full support of the next steps. I want to also acknowledge that and understand and acknowledge the financial situation across the UN that's being experienced at the moment. But I encourage that this is not a reason not to take the next steps. We must use the principles and recommendations outlined in this report. Finally, the Human Rights Council has made some great strides which should be celebrated and a model for the broader UN system. But as we've heard today, more still needs to be done. And I encourage that we continue to engage with Indigenous peoples and states going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Ms. McCullough, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to reaffirm that it's been a true honor for Canada to participate in today's panel and with the co-facilitators, and also to co-facilitate the HRC intersessional meetings. Canada acknowledges that it has historically denied rights to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and that the effects of this legacy persist today. These conversations on enhanced participation have presented an opportunity for Canada to learn from partners and to reflect on our legacy of colonialism. We are committed to continue taking intentional steps to do better. We have listened with great interest to the questions and suggestions from all participants that engaged today on what next steps we can take and should be taken to keep advancing enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples at the HRC. I would like to highlight that the report lays out a clear path to advance this essential work. The state co-facilitators strongly recommend that the HRC take decisive action on the recommendations of this report. This includes taking steps towards finalizing and formalizing the principles and elements identified to inform participation in interactive dialogues as stipulated in the HRC Resolution 57/15, as well as formalizing the role of the expert mechanism as an interim accreditation mechanism. We have heard multiple comments today on this issue of resources in the UN. On this, our final recommendation in the report is that states must ensure that sufficient resources are available to implement all necessary measures to enhance the participation of Indigenous people in the work of the HRC. In line with this, I would like to take this opportunity to share that Canada has renewed its funding to the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples and the Indigenous Fellowship Program for the period 2025 to 2027 in the amount of 3 million Canadian dollars. In closing, Canada will continue to work collaboratively with states and Indigenous partners to reach our goal of achieving the enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples at the UN, in line with their recognized right to self-determination. It is clear to us that a more peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world, which is at the core of the UN's mandate, cannot be achieved without the full and meaningful participation of Indigenous people. Megwich, merci, I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McCullough, for your statement and for the contribution. I would urge you to do a challenge campaign with all the other member states of the UN to meet or beat Canada's contribution. Benota Damai.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. In closing, I'd like to thank to all the Indigenous delegates for your statements. I also thank to the states for your statements and also regarding the questions of the roadmap and next steps. As the outgoing Indigenous co-facilitator, my only view about the next step is this is now in the hand of the Human Rights Council to develop based on the joint report of the intersessional meetings. Let us maintain the spirit of collaboration and mutual respect that has defined our work thus far. It's about co-creating a future where Indigenous peoples' perspectives, philosophies, and worldviews shape the global human rights agenda. This is not only about Indigenous peoples gaining access to the Council. It is about the Council becoming a more inclusive, legitimate, and effective body. A Council that listens not just to voices from the state, but also from the land, from the communities who live the realities of rights, who protect biodiversity, and who carry centuries of knowledge and governance traditions. Let us ensure that the next steps in this journey are guided by affirmative actions, adequate resourcing, institutional support, and most critically, political will. Finally, I urge all states to uphold their human rights obligations by ensuring the safety and security of Indigenous peoples participating in any UN processes free from fear, reprisals, and discrimination. Let's work forward together. Let's co-create a future based on wisdom, empathy, and justice. Thank you once again for the opportunity to share these reflections. I look forward to working together in the spirit of mutual respect and partnerships. Thank you.
We have 6 minutes remaining. I don't know if any of the members of the expert mechanism would like to make any quick concluding remarks. Cheryl?
If we still have time on the clock, I'd like to ask some of the regions that we haven't heard from to take the floor, please.
Thank you for that recommendation. I know that we had a speaker from, and I think it may have been a joint statement from Russia. Let me go back to my long list here. So, okay, Dario Egareva.
I have the honor to speak on behalf of Center for Support of Indigenous Peoples of the North, one of the oldest indigenous institutions in our region. We warmly welcome the ongoing dialogue on enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples in the work of the United Nations and especially within the Human Rights Council. We respectfully call on the expert mechanism to recommend that the Council adopt a decision on this matter as outlined in the Joint Report Human Rights Council 59/35. However, we must also express our deep concern regarding the barriers indigenous organizations face in obtaining registration and accreditation for participation in EMRIP sessions. When indigenous peoples are excluded from these critical spaces, it undermines the very purpose of EMRIP and contradicts its mandate to promote the rights and participation of indigenous peoples. We are especially concerned that indigenous organizations from our region are being excluded from the UN processes. One such case is our organization that has made invaluable contribution to the implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity since 2014. Despite its long-standing work, it has been silenced due to procedural and politically motivated objections. We are troubled that some states can challenge the credibility of indigenous institutions based on technical claims without acknowledging the real work and legitimacy. In forums such as WIPA, which operate by consensus, a single state's objections can effectively block their participation. This raises an urgent question. Are our voices only valid when approved by the state? In many parts of the world today, a child born outside of marriage is no less loved, no less human than one born within a formal union. States don't ask whether a child is born inside or outside of marriage before recognizing their basic rights. Why then do some states demand that indigenous organizations be formally registered in order to be heard? Our indigenous institutions carry out essential work rooted in cultural values and accountability to our peoples. Their worth is not defined by bureaucratic approval, but by the communities they serve. We also wish to underscore that indigenous peoples seek enhanced participation in the Human Rights Council as peoples, not merely as NGOs or individuals. We are right holders with the collective identities. Participations as peoples affirms our right to self-determination and reflects the need for direct representation in global decision-making. We urge the expert mechanism and the Human Rights Council to protect space for all indigenous peoples' institutions because they carry the spirit, strength, and voice of our
My
communities.
apologies, Ms.
Thank
Aguilera.
you. Thank you, Madam
Okay.
Chair. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. We have some remaining seconds. I'll call upon Jean-Paul Mouassa, a joint statement from ANAPAC-RDC, if you're in the room. Are you present? Jean-Paul Mouassa? Is Nasser Abusakar? Okay, please.
Honorable Chair and distinguished delegates, good afternoon. Azul Filawan Sitma Daitma. As Amazigh, the indigenous peoples of Tamizgha in North Africa, we welcome and strongly support the initiative to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples in the United Nations system. For too long, indigenous communities around the world have been sidelined from critical international decision-making processes that directly impact their rights, lands, cultures, and futures. This project represents a vital step towards correcting historical injustices and recognizing indigenous peoples as equal. Proactive stakeholders in global governance, strengthening indigenous participation in the United Nations is not only a matter of justice and inclusion, but it also enriches the United Nations system with unique perspectives, ancestral knowledge, and grassroots solutions that are essential to addressing today's global challenges. And leverage the participation opportunities to, firstly, establish a permanent dedicated mechanism within the United Nations system, including the General Assembly, to ensure the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples across the United Nations bodies. Secondly, guarantee indigenous peoples the right to speak and contribute directly without requiring state approval or intermediary representation in line with their self-determination. Thirdly, allocate the necessary resources to facilitate the participation of indigenous peoples from underrepresented regions, especially in Africa, including Tamizgha, where the Amazigh are located in North Africa. Fourthly, to ensure that participation mechanisms are culturally appropriate, inclusive of indigenous governance structures, and respected of linguistic and regional diversity. Fifth, encourage UN member states to support this initiative by recognizing indigenous peoples.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for your statement. Yeah.
Thank
Apologies to the 60 individuals and organizations that were unable to make an intervention, but because this is an ongoing enterprise to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the UN, we urge you to transmit those statements that you prepared to us for consideration. They will be taken up for consideration. And once again, apologies. This is always, as everyone in the room knows, a challenge for the expert mechanism. And thanks to Cheryl for the addition of 2 speakers so that it went from 62 to 60 individuals that didn't have an opportunity. So grateful for all of the interventions that were made and the forthcoming interventions. Thank you, everyone. The session's adjourned.
you.